And the CBC's Linda Ward is following the outpouring of reaction that continues to come in. And Linda, many people remembering Brian Mulroney. Tell us about that.
Yeah, Canadians and politicians alike reflecting on his legacy today. Some praising his statesmanship, others maybe criticizing his politics. He was tough for sure, and polarizing as well. But for some politicians today, he was first and foremost a mentor. Here's Premier Doug Ford speaking about the passing of the former Prime Minister.
I loved the Prime Minister. You'd call him up, and he even came by our caucus meetings. And you know, when you have a tough day, I'd always give him a call. He'd boost you up. Like I've never seen before. And we just lost such a great Canadian, a Canadian that his legacy carries on today.
And that legacy as well, dotted with some very difficult moments. Remember, he was Prime Minister during the Oka crisis, sending the military in, which caused a lot of conflict between Indigenous peoples and the Crown. After Oka, though, Mulroney established a Royal Commission on Aboriginal peoples, which some say was the first step towards the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We're hearing as well response to his passing from Governor General Mary Simon. She says in a statement, "I will always remember his determination in support of Indigenous rights during the constitutional negotiations in the 1980s and the Charlottetown Accord." So as a statesman, we're hearing about his legacy, but also what he was like as a person, and people sharing their thoughts on that as well today. His former chief of staff spoke about what he was like to work with.
I felt that I was doing something important. He helped make us feel that we were doing something important. He lifted us up and made us feel good. He brought us into the room, and you felt that privilege. And he never stopped representing Canada. And so when you traveled abroad, where you most saw that, and I was privileged enough to have that opportunity, you felt like you were representing the country.
And so, yeah, a lot of reflections today, Andrew, about what he meant to the country, what he meant to politics, but also what he meant to a lot of people personally.
And Linda, Brian Mulroney had a close relationship with the United States. What are you seeing in that country?
Yeah, there's a lot of reflection as well today on what he meant for ties between the two countries and how he brought Canada and the United States together, becoming friends, really, with two U.S. presidents. We're brought back in our thoughts to the Shamrock Summit. Now, this happened back in 1985 in Quebec City. U.S. President Ronald Reagan and Mulroney there, both men of Irish heritage, singing a duet of When Irish Eyes Are Smiling.
Sure they steal your heart away.
And you can see the chemistry there between the two leaders, that chemistry continuing even with the next president, George H.W. Bush. With these relationships, he was able to push through the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, which led to NAFTA, as well as a treaty on acid rain. A lot of thoughts today on his environmental legacy. I think it was MP Adam Van Couverton who said he was green before green was cool. Mulroney writing in a 2012 essay that Canadians were literally shouting at the rain, but the Americans weren't, it wasn't even on the American radar at that point in time. Former Ambassador Bruce Heyman says that all of these things led to a much stronger friendship between the two countries.
These were seeds that were planted that are giant oaks today. I mean, we have now looked at NAFTA in its revisions in USMCA, CUSMCA. We look at the depth and breadth of the way we trade together, work together, the alliances that we've developed that have strengthened over time.
And sometimes that cozy relationship that he had with the United States wasn't popular with everyone, but there's no doubt, Andrew, that they did really lead to Canada and the U.S. having really strong trade relations, and the U.S. being Canada's top ally today.
Linda, thank you. That is the CBC's Linda Ward. Our next guest is Christopher Sands. He is the director of the Canada Institute at the Wilson Centre and is an expert on Canada-U.S. relations. And we've reached him in Washington. Christopher, nice to see you. Again, thank you for taking the time. Just let's begin with your thoughts on the late Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and hearing of his death.
Andrew, I have to say, I don't think there's been a more consequential prime minister for Canada-U.S. relations in my lifetime, if ever. He really reset the relationship. To take the clock back, Canada came out of World War II, still part of the British Empire. Gradually, those ties start to go away. Canada's on its own. It's looking for its place in the world. And there were moments of closeness to the United States, but also rivalry, competition, economic protectionism, doubts during the Vietnamese War, and also during the civil rights debates about segregation and American treatment of African Americans that alienated a lot of Canadians from the United States. When Brian Mulroney came on the scene, he changed that, really embracing free trade, a strong military alliance with the U.S., and support for a U.S.-led global order, which continues everything from the United Nations to the international campaign against apartheid, bringing both Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan closer to sanctions to end that apartheid regime, something for which he was well remembered by Nelson Mandela in Mandela's day. He also, as Linda was mentioning in her segment, he was also a leader on the environment. And we think about, yes, the Acid Rain Treaty, but we also think about the Montreal Protocol on chlorofluorocarbon bans, one of the most effective UN protocols we've had, and the Rio Conference, which was the start of the Conference of Parties on climate change. It's where it all began. And so he was a really visionary leader. He left a big mark. But for me, the key is that he reset Canada-U.S. relations on a very positive, friendly footing, and we're still enjoying that today.
So I want to ask you about a couple of things you mentioned there, but specifically since it was mentioned last was this Acid Rain Treaty. I mean, can you talk about how extraordinary that would be, something that was definitely not on the American agenda at all, and Brian Mulroney was determined, right, and finally got a deal done with a Republican president. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it was dramatic. Acid rain came from soot and other particulates that came from the factories in the American Midwest, my home state of Michigan, Ohio, Illinois. They would push up soot. It would go across through the airwaves, and it would come down as sulfurous rain, and that's why they call it acid rain. It used to wear out buildings, statues, caused a lot of damage on the ground, and affected groundwater as well. So at the time, the United States was very reluctant to legislate against these factories. It wanted to keep its industrial dominance. And Ronald Reagan had expressed real doubts about whether acid rain was anything more than the latest environmentalist fad. But when it came down to it, Mulroney was persistent. And as Ronald Reagan famously said, let's do this for Brian. It was in a way, Reagan's way of saying, I'm not fully convinced, but Brian is asking, I need to do something for him. And so as much as we talk about Canada winning the argument, I think Mulroney himself, through developing close personal relations, made that historic step possible.
And Chris, I was reading the Globe and Mail, so I'm going to credit them today, just talking about a key moment in the free trade negotiations. And this is that he spoke with James Baker. He was a key negotiator on the U.S. side and was going to say to Ronald Reagan, how is it that the Americans can do a nuclear reduction deal with their worst enemy, the Soviet Union, and they can't agree to a free trade agreement with their best friend, the Canadians? So tell us just kind of about those moments.
Well, it was the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, some of the younger viewers may not remember, but it was really a sharp change in Canada-U.S. relations. Now, you know that Sir John Macdonald wanted a trade agreement with the United States. Wilfrid Laurier pursued one. So there was this debate about trade from the beginning. But we really were in a period of sharp competition. The two leaders decided they would do a softwood lumber agreement ahead of Canada-U.S. free trade in order to take it off the table as a precondition to having the rest of the discussions, a legacy we still have. There were tough debates about whether the Auto Pact would be reopened, the 1965 Auto Pact that created free trade for producers within the auto sector. And Canada had said, Simon Reisman, Canada's leading negotiator, said that it's off the table, and yet the Americans wanted to talk about it all the way through. And there was a really important question about Canadian culture. Everything from the CBC to various arts grants. Americans criticized Canada's cultural protectionism, and Mulroney came up with a way to have that sort of off the table for the negotiations, not necessarily free trade or what, but just outside the context of the agreement in order to move forward. But there were a number of congressmen, particularly some tough senators who were worried about softwood lumber, who disagreed with some of Canadians' trade practices, and they threatened to trash the agreement in the Senate, which was the body that would ultimately approve the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. So Reagan's reluctance in part was he didn't think he could get this agreement through the Senate. In the end, he was able to do it. But I think for many Canadians, Brian Mulroney spoke it exactly as he should have, which is you can negotiate tough arms control treaties, but you can't negotiate with Canada. Let's find a way to make a deal. And they did.
And Chris, just finally, we don't have a lot of time, but you mentioned apartheid and Ronald Reagan and Mulroney, really working to try and bring Ronald Reagan on side for Nelson Mandela to be freed and for the apartheid regime to be gone. And of course, we know Brian Mulroney gave the eulogy at Ronald Reagan's funeral. Can you tell us just a little bit about that influence that Mulroney had?
It was an incredible moment. Apartheid had been with us for a long time. South Africa was something of a pariah state, but the United States and also Great Britain took the view that we shouldn't disengage. We shouldn't ask our companies to leave. We should find ways to quietly work within South Africa for change. And there were, of course, the famous Lewis Sullivan principles that came from Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Health and Human Services, talking about how could we engage in a way that was positive. But for Mulroney, all of those were half measures. They were going to sustain the regime, not bring about a dramatic change. And he was able to convince both Thatcher and Reagan to take a tougher stand. That was the beginning of a change because it sent a signal to the South African apartheid leaders that they were on the wrong side of history and that sooner or later US, UK, and global pressure would force them to change. It was at that moment they decided, time to let Nelson Mandela out of jail. Let's have a peaceful transition. And you only have to look at Zimbabwe to see what a nasty transition was possible for South Africa. That was obviously a much tougher transition, much bloodier, and went to multiple years of dictatorship under Robert Mugabe. So this was a real breakthrough, and I give Brian Mulroney real credit for taking that stance.
Christopher, thank you. That was Christopher Sands in Washington.